"Drive faster, Victoria. We need to lose her before the next checkpoint." Those were the last words my husband Marcus spoke to me before abandoning me in the middle of the Masai Mara with nothing but a backpack and my camera. He thought he was teaching me a lesson about independence and adventure. What he didn't know was that I had been secretly funding wildlife conservation efforts across East Africa for 3 years, and the helicopter bearing my foundation's logo would arrive within hours to collect me for an emergency rhino rescue mission. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Land Rover's engine coughed and sputtered as it navigated the rutted dirt roads of Kenya's most famous wildlife reserve, kicking up clouds of red dust that settled on everything like a fine layer of disappointment. I gripped the dashboard as we hit another pothole, watching the endless savanna stretch toward the horizon, where acacia trees dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels guarding secrets I was only beginning to understand. My name is Victoria Ashford, and at 31 years old, I had built what most people would consider a successful life. I worked as a senior marketing director for a pharmaceutical company in Chicago, owned a downtown condo, drove a BMW, and had been married to Marcus Rothwell for 4 years. On paper, everything looked perfect. In reality, I felt like I was slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations that had never truly been my own. Marcus sat behind the wheel with his characteristic smug expression, the one that suggested he possessed superior knowledge about everything from wine selection to African wildlife. He was 35, worked in corporate finance, and approached every experience like a conquest to be dominated, rather than a moment to be appreciated. This safari represented his latest attempt to prove his adventurous masculinity, while simultaneously demonstrating my supposed inadequacy. "I told you this trip would be too challenging for someone with your delicate sensibilities," he said, glancing at me through the rearview mirror with that condescending smile I had grown to despise. "Real adventure requires a certain type of person, someone who can handle uncertainty and discomfort without constantly complaining." The irony of his statement was almost overwhelming, considering that I had been secretly managing wildlife conservation projects across 3 countries, while he remained completely oblivious to my passion for environmental protection. For the past 3 years, I had been using my marketing salary and investment returns to fund anti-poaching operations, elephant orphanages, and community education programs throughout East Africa. Every month, I transferred substantial portions of my income to conservation organizations that Marcus knew nothing about. I had learned Swahili through online courses during my lunch breaks, studied wildlife biology through university extension programs, and maintained correspondence with rangers, researchers, and local community leaders across Kenya and Tanzania. My Chicago colleagues saw me as the pharmaceutical marketing professional, but my real identity was someone completely different. The initial inspiration had come during a documentary about elephant poaching that I watched alone one evening, while Marcus attended another finance industry networking event. The footage of orphaned baby elephants mourning their murdered mothers had affected me so profoundly that I could not sleep for weeks. I began researching conservation organizations, learning about the complex challenges facing African wildlife, and gradually developing relationships with people who dedicated their lives to protecting endangered species. My first donation had been modest, just $500 to a rhino sanctuary in Kenya. But, as my pharmaceutical career advanced and my investment portfolio grew, so did my contributions to conservation work. Within 2 years, I was funding entire anti-poaching units, supporting local communities that protected wildlife corridors, and financing research projects that tracked animal movements and population dynamics. The conservation work had given my life meaning and purpose that my corporate marketing career never provided. Every month, I received updates about elephants saved from poaching attempts, rhinos relocated to safer territories, and communities empowered to protect wildlife resources through sustainable tourism development. I was making a real difference in preserving some of the world's most magnificent creatures, and Marcus had no idea that any of it existed. The Land Rover hit another series of potholes, and I watched a herd of zebras scatter across the grasslands, their black and white stripes creating patterns against the golden savanna that took my breath away. This landscape represented everything I had been fighting to protect from thousands of miles away, but Marcus saw it merely as an exotic backdrop for his latest adventure story. "Look at those zebras running," he said with excitement that seemed genuine for the first time during our trip. They probably think we are predators coming to hunt them. It is amazing how survival instincts work in the wild. His comment revealed the fundamental difference in how we approach this experience. Marcus saw wildlife through the lens of conquest and dominance, viewing animals as subjects to be observed and potentially controlled. I saw the same zebras as complex social creatures whose survival depended on maintaining ancient migration patterns that were increasingly threatened by human encroachment, climate change, and infrastructure development. The zebras were part of the Great Migration, one of the most spectacular wildlife phenomena on Earth, where millions of animals moved across the Serengeti Mara ecosystem following rainfall patterns and grass growth cycles. I knew from my conservation research that this migration was under unprecedented pressure from farming expansion, road construction, and changing weather patterns that disrupted traditional movement routes. Every zebra we observed represented a small victory for conservation efforts that worked to maintain corridor connections between protected areas. The anti-poaching units I funded helped ensure that these animals could complete their journeys without falling victim to snares or illegal hunting. The community education programs I supported taught local residents about the economic benefits of wildlife tourism, creating incentives for protection rather than exploitation. Marcus pulled the Land Rover to a stop near a watering hole where various species had gathered during the heat of midday. Elephants wallowed in the muddy water while giraffes stretched their impossibly long necks to drink, their legs spread wide for balance. Warthogs darted between the larger animals, and colorful birds perched on the backs of buffalo, creating a scene that represented the interconnected complexity of African ecosystems. "This is where real men prove themselves," Marcus announced, reaching into his pack and pulling out an expensive camera with a telephoto lens that cost more than most people earned in months. Anyone can take pictures from the safety of a vehicle, but getting close enough for truly impressive shots requires courage and skill. I watched in horror as Marcus opened the vehicle door and began walking toward the watering hole with his camera, completely ignoring every safety protocol that governed wildlife viewing in protected areas. Approaching animals on foot was not only dangerous for humans, but also created stress for wildlife that could disrupt feeding and drinking patterns essential for survival. "Marcus, get back in the vehicle," I called after him, my voice carrying a tone of authority that reflected years of studying wildlife behavior and conservation protocols. "You are disturbing the animals and violating park regulations that exist for everyone's safety." He turned back toward me with that familiar expression of dismissive arrogance. "Victoria, you can stay in the car like a frightened tourist if you want, but I came here to have authentic African experiences, not to be limited by rules designed for people who lack adventure spirit." The elephants at the watering hole had noticed Marcus's approach and were beginning to show signs of agitation. The matriarch lifted her head and spread her ears, clear warning signals that indicated increasing tension within the herd. I knew from my conservation studies that elephant families were extremely protective of watering areas and would defend their access to water resources against perceived threats. "The elephants are showing defensive postures," I called out, trying to get Marcus to understand the seriousness of the situation without revealing the extent of my wildlife knowledge. "You need to return to the vehicle immediately before someone gets hurt." Instead of heeding my warning, Marcus moved even closer to the elephants, apparently convinced that his presence demonstrated superior courage rather than dangerous ignorance. He raised his expensive camera and began taking photographs, the clicking sounds and bright flash creating additional stress for animals that were already wary of human intrusion. The matriarch elephant trumpeted a warning call and took several steps toward Marcus, her massive bulk and obvious agitation, making her intentions unmistakably clear. The rest of the herd began gathering behind her, presenting a unified front against what they perceived as a threat to their water access and calf safety. I jumped out of the Land Rover and began walking quickly toward Marcus, knowing that someone needed to defuse this potentially deadly situation before it escalated beyond control. My conservation training had included wildlife behavior courses that taught recognition of animal stress signals and appropriate human responses to dangerous encounters. "Marcus, stop moving and slowly back away from the elephants," I commanded, using the firm voice I had learned during emergency response training with conservation organizations. "Do not run, do not make sudden movements, and do not take any more photographs." The matriarch elephant was now less than 30 feet from Marcus, her trunk raised and her eyes focused directly on him with unmistakable intent. She was communicating as clearly as possible that he needed to leave the area immediately, but his arrogance prevented him from understanding the gravity of the situation he had created. I reached Marcus just as the elephant began her charge, a thundering display of power and protective instinct that would have trampled him without hesitation if the situation continued escalating. I grabbed his arm and pulled him backwards while speaking in calm, low tones that I hoped would signal non-threatening intentions to the agitated herd. "Walk slowly toward the vehicle," I instructed, maintaining eye contact with the matriarch while guiding Marcus away from immediate danger. "Do not look back, do not make any sudden movements, and do not speak until we reach safety." The elephants watched our retreat with continued vigilance but allowed us to return to the Land Rover without pursuing further confrontation. As soon as we were safely inside the vehicle, I started the engine and drove us away from the watering hole, leaving the elephant family to resume their peaceful drinking and bathing activities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus sat in stunned silence for several minutes, apparently processing how close he had come to serious injury or death because of his reckless behavior. When he finally spoke, however, his words revealed that he had learned nothing from the experience and was actually angry about being prevented from continuing his dangerous photography session. "You embarrassed me in front of those animals," he said, his voice carrying the petulant tone of someone accustomed to having his authority unquestioned. "I was getting incredible photographs that would have impressed everyone back home, and you ruined the opportunity because you were too scared to let me take reasonable risks." His response revealed everything I needed to know about Marcus's character and our fundamental incompatibility. He saw my intervention as embarrassment rather than life-saving action. He valued impressive photographs more than wildlife welfare or personal safety. He interpreted my knowledge and quick thinking as interference rather than expertise that had prevented disaster. The incident at the watering hole crystallized years of growing dissatisfaction with a relationship where my intelligence and capabilities were consistently dismissed or minimized. Marcus had never shown genuine interest in my conservation work because he had never bothered to ask about my actual passions and interests beyond surface-level conversation. As we continued driving through the reserve, I began formulating a plan that would allow me to pursue my real calling in wildlife conservation, while extracting myself from a marriage that had become a barrier to personal growth and authentic self-expression. The elephants had taught me something important about defending what matters most, and it was time to apply that lesson to my own life circumstances. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the savannah as we approached our campsite for the evening. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would change everything. But tonight I would spend my time planning for a future that aligned with my true values and aspirations, rather than Marcus's limited vision of who I was supposed to be. The zebras were still moving across the distant plains, following ancient pathways that had guided their ancestors for millennia. Soon I would be following my own instinctual path toward meaningful work that connected my resources, skills, and passion for wildlife protection. The transformation was about to begin, sparked by elephants who understood something about protective courage that I was finally ready to embrace. The campfire crackled in the darkness as the sounds of the African night surrounded our temporary shelter beneath a canvas of stars that seemed impossibly bright after years of Chicago's light pollution. Hyenas called in the distance, their haunting voices creating a soundtrack that spoke of wildness and ancient rhythms that predated human civilization by millions of years. I sat on a folding chair with my journal, documenting the day's wildlife sightings while Marcus consumed his third beer and regaled our Maasai guide Joseph with exaggerated stories of his supposed business conquests. Joseph Nakuru had been guiding safari expeditions for 15 years, and his weathered face reflected both wisdom about the natural world and patience with tourists who failed to understand the complexities of wilderness survival. He was 42 years old, spoke 4 languages fluently, and possessed knowledge about animal behavior, weather patterns, and traditional ecological practices that represented generations of accumulated wisdom. Throughout the day, I had noticed his subtle expressions of concern whenever Marcus displayed particularly reckless behavior or ignorant commentary about wildlife management. Tomorrow, we will visit the Conservancy area, where local communities work with conservation organizations to protect wildlife corridors, Joseph explained, his English carrying the melodic accent of someone whose first language was Ma. These partnerships create economic opportunities for families while maintaining traditional grazing patterns that support both livestock and wild animals. His mention of community conservation partnerships immediately captured my attention because these were exactly the types of programs I had been funding through my secret charitable work. I knew from extensive research that community-based conservation represented the most sustainable approach to wildlife protection, creating incentive structures that aligned local economic interests with environmental preservation goals. Marcus, however, responded with the dismissive arrogance that had become increasingly insufferable over the past 4 years of marriage. Joseph, those conservation programs are just feel-good initiatives that interfere with real economic development, he declared, gesturing with his beer bottle for emphasis. Africa needs industrial growth and modern agriculture, not romantic ideas about traditional lifestyles and wild animals. The ignorance and cultural insensitivity of his statement made me physically uncomfortable, particularly because I knew from direct experience that community conservation programs generated substantial revenue through sustainable tourism while protecting ecosystems that provided essential services, including water filtration, soil stabilization, and climate regulation. The communities involved in these partnerships earned significantly more income from wildlife tourism than they could generate through agriculture or livestock alone. Actually, Marcus, the economic data suggests something quite different, I said, unable to remain silent while he spouted misinformation that contradicted everything I had learned through years of conservation research. Community-based conservation programs consistently outperform traditional development approaches in terms of both environmental protection and long-term economic sustainability. Marcus turned toward me with that familiar expression of condescending surprise, as though he could not believe I possessed knowledge about subjects he considered beyond my intellectual capacity. Victoria, your pharmaceutical marketing background hardly qualifies you to understand complex economic development issues in Africa, he said with a tone that dismissed my contribution to the conversation entirely. Joseph observed this exchange with the diplomatic neutrality of someone accustomed to managing interpersonal conflicts during extended wilderness expeditions, but I noticed his slight nod of approval when I mentioned economic data supporting conservation approaches. His reaction suggested that he recognized accuracy in my statement, despite Marcus's attempt to discredit my knowledge. The tension between Marcus and me had been building throughout the day, fed by his constant need to demonstrate superiority while simultaneously dismissing any expertise I displayed regarding wildlife, conservation, or African environmental issues. His behavior reflected a pattern of intellectual domination that had characterized our entire relationship, where my interests and knowledge were systematically minimized to maintain his position as the authority on virtually every subject. As the evening progressed, Marcus began outlining his plan for the following day with characteristic arrogance and complete disregard for Joseph's professional guidance. "I want to get close enough to lions for dramatic photographs," he announced, his words slightly slurred from alcohol consumption. "None of this staying in the vehicle nonsense. I want authentic African adventure stories to share with colleagues back home." Joseph's expression grew serious as he recognized the potential danger in Marcus's demands. "Sir, approaching lions on foot is extremely dangerous and violates Kenya Wildlife Service regulations," he explained patiently. "Lions are apex predators that can attack without warning, particularly during feeding times or when protecting cubs." Marcus waved off Joseph's concerns with the casual dismissal of someone who believed expertise could be overcome through confidence and determination. "Joseph, I am paying for this expedition, and I expect to get experiences worthy of the investment," he said, his tone carrying implicit threats about payment and recommendations that guides depend upon for their livelihoods. I watched Joseph's internal struggle between professional safety responsibilities and economic pressures that forced guides to accommodate unreasonable client demands or risk losing income essential for supporting extended families. This dynamic represented one of the systemic challenges facing sustainable tourism in Africa, where economic desperation sometimes forced local professionals to compromise safety standards or environmental ethics. "Marcus," Joseph's concerns are legitimate, I interjected, drawing upon knowledge gained through conversations with rangers and guides whose reports I received through conservation funding relationships. Lion encounters require specific protocols developed through decades of experience. Ignoring professional guidance could result in injuries or fatalities that would devastate Joseph's career and potentially harm tourism in the entire region. My defense of Joseph's expertise triggered Marcus's most aggressive response of the evening. He stood up from his chair and pointed his beer bottle at me with theatrical anger that seemed designed more for dramatic effect than genuine emotion. "Victoria, I am tired of your constant interference and know-it-all attitude," he declared loud enough for his voice to carry across the camp. "This trip was supposed to be about adventure and authentic experiences, but you keep undermining every decision with your nervous complaints and second-hand information." The accusation was particularly infuriating because my second-hand information actually represented years of direct correspondence with wildlife professionals, extensive study of peer-reviewed research, and practical experience funding conservation operations across multiple countries. I possessed more genuine expertise about African wildlife conservation than Marcus had ever demonstrated regarding any subject, but his ego prevented acknowledgement of knowledge that did not originate from his own research or experience. Joseph excused himself diplomatically and retreated to his own tent, leaving Marcus and me alone beside the dying campfire to continue our increasingly heated argument without an audience. The sounds of the African night seemed to intensify around us, as though the wilderness itself was bearing witness to the breakdown of our relationship. "You want authentic African adventure?" I asked, my voice carrying years of accumulated frustration with his dismissive treatment of my intelligence and interests. "Then stop treating everything like a conquest designed to impress your finance colleagues, and start showing some respect for the people and places we are supposed to be here to appreciate." Marcus responded by launching into a tirade about my supposed inadequacies as a wife and traveling companion, listing grievances that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of partnership as a relationship between equals, rather than a hierarchy where his preferences automatically took precedence over mine. His complaints included my reluctance to participate in activities he enjoyed, my tendency to research destinations rather than simply experiencing them, and my habit of forming opinions about subjects he considered beyond my expertise. The irony of his criticisms was overwhelming, considering that my conservation research had led to deeper appreciation for African ecosystems than his surface-level adventure-seeking could ever provide. My tendency to research had resulted in knowledge that could contribute meaningfully to wildlife protection efforts, while his approach treated the continent as an exotic backdrop for personal entertainment rather than a complex environment deserving respect and understanding. Our argument continued for nearly 2 hours, covering years of unresolved conflicts about my career priorities, social preferences, and intellectual interests that Marcus had consistently dismissed as inconsequential or misguided. By the time we finally retreated to our respective sleeping areas, it was clear that fundamental incompatibilities in values and worldview had made our marriage unsustainable. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the savannah stretching endlessly toward horizons that seemed to promise infinite possibilities for those willing to pursue them with appropriate preparation and respect. Joseph had already prepared breakfast and was checking equipment when Marcus emerged from his tent with obvious hangover symptoms and renewed determination to pursue dangerous wildlife encounters. "Today we are going to find lions," Marcus announced to Joseph, as though his declaration could override safety protocols and professional judgment through sheer force of will. "I do not care about regulations or recommendations. I want photographs that will make people back home jealous of my African adventure experiences." Joseph attempted once more to explain the risks and legal restrictions associated with Marcus's demands, but his words fell on deaf ears as Marcus began loading camera equipment with obsessive focus on achieving his predetermined goals regardless of consequences. I watched this preparation with growing concern, recognizing that his reckless behavior could endanger not only himself but also Joseph, whose livelihood depended upon maintaining impeccable safety records. As we loaded into the Land Rover for our final day of game driving, Marcus outlined his plan to abandon established roads and drive across open grasslands in pursuit of lion prides that Joseph knew should not be approached without specialized equipment and additional safety personnel. His proposal violated multiple Kenya Wildlife Service regulations and ignored ecological principles designed to minimize human impact on wildlife behavior. "Marcus, what you are suggesting is illegal and dangerous," I said, making one final attempt to introduce reason into his decision-making process. "We should follow Joseph's guidance and observe wildlife responsibly rather than pursuing dramatic encounters that could harm both animals and people." His response revealed the depth of his contempt for my contributions to any decision-making process. "Victoria, if you cannot handle real adventure, maybe you should have stayed home in Chicago where everything is safe and predictable," he said with a sneer that made his feelings about my presence perfectly clear. "Some people are built for extraordinary experiences, and others are built for ordinary lives." The insult was intended to wound, but instead it crystallized my understanding of how completely Marcus misunderstood both my character and my capabilities. He saw my caution as weakness rather than wisdom, my knowledge as interference rather than expertise, and my conservation values as limitations rather than principles worth defending. As we drove deeper into the conservancy area, Marcus began implementing his plan to abandon established vehicle tracks and pursue wildlife across sensitive grasslands that served as crucial grazing areas for both domestic livestock and wild herbivores. Despite Joseph's increasing protests, Marcus took control of the driving and steered us toward a distant acacia grove where lions were reportedly resting during the midday heat. The terrain became progressively more challenging as we moved away from maintained roads, with hidden rocks, termite mounds, and soft soil creating hazardous driving conditions that required specialized knowledge to navigate safely. Marcus's aggressive driving style ignored these obstacles, focusing solely on reaching the lions regardless of potential damage to the vehicle or surrounding environment. 20 minutes into this cross-country pursuit, the inevitable occurred. Our Land Rover struck a concealed rock that punctured the oil pan and damaged the transmission, leaving us stranded 15 miles from the nearest road, with a disabled vehicle and no immediate means of communication with park authorities or rescue services. Marcus's reaction to this crisis revealed everything about his character and leadership capabilities under pressure. Rather than accepting responsibility for the poor decisions that created our predicament, he immediately began blaming Joseph for failing to prevent the accident, and me for undermining his confidence with constant criticism of his driving approach. "This is exactly what happens when people question every decision," he declared, kicking the disabled Land Rover in frustration. "If you had supported my choices instead of creating doubt and negativity, we would have reached the lions successfully." Joseph began assessing our situation with professional calm, checking emergency supplies, evaluating our distance from assistance, and calculating rationing strategies for food and water until rescue could be arranged. His behavior demonstrated the competence and leadership that Marcus claimed to possess, but had never actually displayed during crisis situations. "We have enough water for 2 days if we are careful," Joseph reported. "Emergency beacon will signal our location to Kenya Wildlife Service headquarters, but rescue could take 12 to 18 hours depending on vehicle availability and weather conditions." As Joseph activated emergency protocols with quiet efficiency, Marcus continued his theatrical display of anger and blame assignment, apparently believing that loud complaints could somehow alter the reality of our situation. His behavior during this crisis confirmed everything I had suspected about his character under pressure and his complete unsuitability as a partner for navigating life's genuine challenges. The African sun blazed overhead as we settled into the shade of the nearest acacia tree to wait for rescue, surrounded by the vast wilderness that Marcus had been so eager to conquer, but was now completely dependent upon others to escape. The irony of our situation was not lost on me, particularly as I began formulating the plan that would transform this crisis into the catalyst for claiming my authentic life in wildlife conservation. The emergency beacon Joseph activated should have brought rescue within 18 hours, but Marcus had other plans that would transform a manageable inconvenience into a deliberate act of cruelty that revealed his true character. As we waited beneath the acacia tree for Kenya Wildlife Service personnel to locate our position, Marcus began pacing with agitated energy that suggested he was formulating a scheme rather than simply processing our predicament with appropriate patience. The afternoon heat had reached its peak intensity, with temperatures exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity levels that made every breath feel labored, despite the shade provided by the thorny canopy above us. Joseph had organized our emergency supplies with professional efficiency, rationing water bottles and energy bars, while monitoring radio frequencies for communication from park headquarters regarding rescue coordination efforts. I sat quietly reviewing my conservation research notes, which I always carried during international travel to remote locations where internet access might be limited or unavailable. These documents contained contact information for wildlife organizations, community conservancy managers, and research institutions across East Africa that represented my network of professional relationships, developed through years of funding various protection initiatives. Marcus's pacing intensified as he observed my calm demeanor during what he clearly expected to be a crisis that would validate his leadership capabilities and demonstrate my supposed helplessness in challenging situations. His agitation seemed to increase rather than decrease as hours passed without the dramatic rescue scenario he had apparently envisioned, where his take-charge attitude would impress both Joseph and me with his crisis management skills. "Victoria, you seem remarkably composed for someone stranded in the middle of nowhere," Marcus said with suspicious tone that suggested my lack of panic somehow disappointed his expectations. "Most people would be more concerned about our situation and more grateful for having someone experienced to handle the emergency procedures." His comment revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of both wilderness survival and my actual character traits, developed through years of international travel related to conservation work. I had visited remote locations across 3 continents, often in areas with limited infrastructure or communication capabilities, and had learned to approach unexpected situations with calm analysis rather than emotional reactions that could complicate problem-solving efforts. "Panic serves no useful purpose in emergency situations," I replied, keeping my voice level while continuing to review my notes. "Joseph has activated appropriate rescue protocols, we have adequate supplies for the expected wait time, and becoming anxious would only make the experience more unpleasant for everyone involved." My rational response triggered Marcus's most revealing outburst of the entire expedition. He stopped pacing and turned toward me with an expression of anger that seemed disproportionate to our actual circumstances, as though my composure during adversity represented a personal affront to his masculine identity and leadership pretensions. "That attitude perfectly exemplifies everything wrong with your approach to life," he declared, his voice carrying years of accumulated resentment about my failure to conform to his expectations of feminine dependence. "You treat every experience like an academic exercise instead of allowing yourself to feel genuine emotions or recognize when you need someone stronger to protect and guide you." Joseph observed this exchange with diplomatic neutrality, but I noticed his slight frown of disapproval at Marcus's characterization of appropriate emergency behavior. As an experienced guide who had managed numerous crisis situations, Joseph understood that calm thinking and systematic problem-solving represented superior crisis response compared to emotional reactions that could escalate dangerous situations unnecessarily. The afternoon stretched into early evening as we waited for rescue vehicles to navigate the challenging terrain between our location and established park roads. During this time, Marcus's behavior became progressively more erratic, as his anticipated leadership moment failed to materialize according to his predetermined script. Rather than accepting the reality of our situation and making the best of temporary inconvenience, Marcus began developing what appeared to be a punitive plan designed to create genuine hardship that would force me to demonstrate the helpless dependence he seemed to require for his masculine self-image. As sunset approached and rescue had still not arrived, Joseph began preparing for the possibility that we might need to spend the night in our current location. He gathered dry wood for a signal fire, identified sleeping areas protected from wind and potential animal encounters, and organized our remaining supplies for extended duration survival if weather or mechanical problems delayed rescue efforts beyond the expected time frame. Marcus watched these preparations with growing irritation, apparently frustrated that Joseph's competence eliminated opportunities for him to demonstrate superior wilderness skills or protective capabilities. His behavior suggested that he viewed our predicament as a stage performance where he expected to play the heroic lead role, with Joseph and me serving as grateful supporting cast members who would validate his abilities through expressions of dependence and admiration. "Joseph, I think we should attempt to walk back to the main road tomorrow morning if rescue has not arrived by then," Marcus announced, despite having no knowledge of the terrain, distance, or potential hazards associated with such an undertaking. Sitting here waiting for other people to solve our problems shows weakness and lack of initiative. Joseph's response revealed both professional experience and cultural wisdom about wilderness survival that contradicted Marcus's amateur assessment of appropriate emergency procedures. Sir, walking 15 miles across unfamiliar territory without adequate water or navigation equipment would create much greater danger than remaining in this location where rescuers know to find us, he explained patiently. Emergency protocols exist because they represent lessons learned from previous situations where people made poor decisions under stress. Marcus's reaction to this expert guidance revealed the depth of his ego investment in being perceived as someone who could overcome challenges through determination, rather than accepting professional advice from people whose knowledge exceeded his own. He began arguing with Joseph about wilderness survival priorities, despite having no relevant experience or training that would qualify him to contradict established emergency procedures. I listened to this argument with growing concern, recognizing that Marcus's need to assert dominance over the situation could lead to dangerous decisions that would endanger all of us unnecessarily. His behavior patterns throughout our relationship had consistently demonstrated his inability to accept guidance from people whose expertise exceeded his own, particularly when that acceptance would require acknowledging his limitations. As darkness approached and rescue remained delayed, Marcus's frustration reached a breaking point that would lead to actions I never imagined anyone could consider, let alone implement against someone they claimed to love. His pacing resumed with increased intensity, and he began muttering complaints about our situation that focused more on blame assignment than problem solving. This entire expedition has been compromised by negative attitudes and excessive caution, he declared, gesturing toward me with obvious resentment. Real adventure requires people willing to take risks and push boundaries, not individuals who constantly worry about regulations and potential consequences. Joseph maintained diplomatic silence during these complaints, but his expression revealed concern about Marcus's increasingly irrational behavior and potential impact on group cohesion during a situation that required cooperation and mutual support rather than blame and recrimination. The rescue helicopter arrived just after sunrise the following morning, its distinctive sound creating relief that should have marked the end of our minor adventure and return to normal safari activities. Kenya Wildlife Service personnel quickly assessed our situation, confirmed that everyone was unharmed, and began coordinating vehicle recovery and transportation back to our scheduled itinerary. However, Marcus's response to the arrival of professional rescue services revealed planning that he had apparently been developing throughout the night while Joseph and I slept. Rather than expressing gratitude for efficient emergency response, Marcus approached the rescue coordinator with a request that would change everything about our relationship and my understanding of his character. "I need to speak with you privately about a passenger issue," Marcus told the rescue coordinator, leading him away from our group for a conversation I could not overhear but whose content would soon become devastatingly clear. 20 minutes later, the rescue coordinator returned with an expression of professional confusion that suggested Marcus had made some sort of unusual request requiring careful consideration. Joseph and I were instructed to gather our belongings for transportation to the nearest ranger station, but Marcus remained behind for additional discussion with rescue personnel. "Victoria," Marcus called out as I prepared to board the rescue helicopter, "there has been a change of plans regarding your participation in the remainder of our expedition." His words carried an ominous tone that immediately activated my emergency instincts developed through years of international travel in potentially unstable situations. I turned toward him with growing apprehension, recognizing in his expression something cold and calculating that I had never seen before during 4 years of marriage. "What kind of change?" I asked, setting down my pack while maintaining eye contact that would allow me to read his intentions more clearly. Marcus's smile contained no warmth or affection, as he delivered words that would haunt me for years afterward. "I have arranged for you to have some time alone to think about your attitude and approach to adventure travel," he said with satisfaction that suggested he had been anticipating this moment since our argument began. "The rescue team will transport you to a research station where you can reflect on how your negativity and constant criticism have affected our expedition experience." The casual cruelty of his statement took several seconds to fully register. Marcus was not simply ending our safari early or returning to Nairobi for relationship counseling. He was abandoning me in one of the most remote wilderness areas in East Africa, hundreds of miles from any major city, with minimal supplies and no predetermined plan for my return to civilization. Marcus, you cannot be serious about leaving me here, I said, my voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline surge that accompanied recognition of genuine danger. We are married. Whatever problems we have can be addressed through conversation and compromise, not through abandonment in a foreign country. His response revealed preparation and calculation that demonstrated this was not an impulsive decision made under stress, but rather a deliberate plan developed over hours or possibly days, as punishment for my failure to conform to his expectations of grateful dependence during our relationship difficulties. Victoria, you have spent our entire marriage questioning my decisions and undermining my authority through your know-it-all attitude, he said with conviction that suggested he genuinely believed his actions were justified. Maybe some time alone in Africa will help you understand what you have been taking for granted, and develop appreciation for having a husband who provides stability and security. Joseph observed this exchange with obvious alarm, recognizing that Marcus was proposing actions that violated both moral obligations and legal responsibilities associated with international travel partnerships. His expression suggested that he wanted to intervene but was uncertain about his authority to override decisions made by paying clients regarding their personal relationships. The rescue coordinator returned to our group with radio communication equipment and transportation schedules that would separate Marcus and me permanently, unless I could convince him to reconsider his plan. However, his determination to proceed with abandonment appeared fixed, supported by what he clearly viewed as justified punishment for my supposed inadequacies as a wife and travel companion. The research station is staffed with qualified personnel who can provide accommodation and basic supplies, Marcus explained with false reasonableness that was intended to make his actions seem considerate rather than cruel. You will have time to think about our relationship and your role in creating the problems we have experienced during this expedition. I realized with growing horror that Marcus had spent hours convincing rescue personnel that I was a difficult passenger who needed temporary separation from the group for everyone's safety and comfort.
His manipulation of the situation demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to present abandonment as reasonable conflict resolution rather than deliberate cruelty. The research station he referenced was legitimate, operated by international wildlife organizations as a base for long-term ecological studies in the Masai Mara ecosystem. However, reaching this facility required helicopter transport across terrain that would be impossible to traverse on foot, and departure scheduling depended upon research priorities rather than tourist convenience. Marcus had essentially arranged for me to be marooned at a remote scientific facility with no predetermined departure date and no means of independent transportation back to populated areas. The research station staff would provide basic accommodation and meals, but I would be dependent upon their project schedules and transportation availability for any possibility of returning to Nairobi or international airport access. Victoria, your backpack contains sufficient supplies for several days and the research station personnel are expecting your arrival, Marcus continued, his tone suggesting that he viewed this arrangement as generous rather than punitive. Use this time to consider how you want our relationship to develop when we return to Chicago. As the rescue helicopter prepared for departure with Marcus aboard, I stood in the African wilderness holding my backpack and camera while processing the reality that my husband had deliberately abandoned me thousands of miles from home as punishment for displaying knowledge and independence that threatened his ego and control fantasies. The helicopter lifted off with Marcus visible through the window, his expression showing satisfaction rather than concern as he left me stranded in one of the most remote locations on Earth. Joseph remained with the ground crew that would transport me to the research station, his face reflecting both professional obligation and personal distress at witnessing such calculated cruelty. As the sound of the helicopter faded into the distance, I felt something shift inside me that would change everything about how I viewed myself, my capabilities, and my future possibilities. Marcus had intended this abandonment as punishment that would force me to recognize my dependence upon his protection and guidance. Instead, he had unwittingly placed me in the exact environment where my secret conservation expertise and professional relationships would transform from hidden assets into the foundation for claiming my authentic identity as a wildlife protection advocate and environmental leader. The research station represented not imprisonment, but liberation into the world where my true passions and capabilities could finally flourish, without the constraints of a relationship that had been systematically diminishing my potential for years. The Masai Mara Research Station emerged from the golden grasslands like a scientific oasis, its collection of weathered buildings and solar panels representing humanity's attempt to understand one of Earth's most complex ecosystems. As Joseph and the Kenya Wildlife Service transport vehicle approached the facility, I felt a mixture of apprehension and unexpected excitement about what this abandonment might actually represent in terms of opportunity rather than punishment. Dr. Sarah Kiptanui, the station's director, greeted our arrival with the professional courtesy of someone accustomed to managing unexpected visitors in remote locations. She was approximately 45 years old, with intelligent eyes that reflected decades of field research experience and the quiet confidence that comes from genuine expertise in challenging environments. Her handshake was firm, her smile warm, and her immediate assessment of my situation suggested both competence and compassion. Ms. Ashford, your husband explained that you requested time at our facility to pursue independent research interests, she said, her tone carefully neutral in a way that suggested she had detected inconsistencies in Marcus's explanation, but was too diplomatic to express skepticism directly. We are always pleased to accommodate visitors who share our commitment to wildlife conservation and ecological research. Joseph provided a brief explanation of our circumstances that revealed more about the true nature of my abandonment than Marcus's manipulated version had conveyed. Dr. Kiptanui listened with growing concern, particularly when Joseph described Marcus's behavior during our disabled vehicle emergency and his apparent satisfaction while arranging my departure to the research station. I see, she said quietly, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to something approaching protective concern. Perhaps we should discuss your situation more privately. While Joseph completes the transportation logistics, quote, Dr. Kiptanui led me to her office, a functional space filled with research papers, wildlife photographs, and computer equipment that connected the remote station to conservation organizations worldwide. Maps of the Masai Mara ecosystem covered the walls, marked with migration patterns, research sites, and community conservancy boundaries that represented years of collaborative work between scientists and local populations. Ms. Ashford, I have been managing this research station for 12 years, and I have never encountered a situation where someone was essentially abandoned here by a spouse, she began, her voice carrying both professionalism and genuine concern. Before we discuss accommodation arrangements, I need to understand whether you are here voluntarily or whether you require assistance contacting authorities about your circumstances. Her direct approach and obvious expertise created an environment where I felt safe revealing the true extent of my situation and my background in conservation funding that Marcus had never bothered to learn about or acknowledge. For the first time in years, I was speaking with someone who possessed the knowledge and experience to understand both the scientific and personal aspects of my predicament. Dr. Kiptanui, there are aspects of my background that my husband never took the time to discover, I said, reaching into my backpack to retrieve the conservation research files that I always carried during international travel. I have been funding wildlife protection initiatives across East Africa for 3 years, including several projects that may be familiar to your research community. I spread my documentation across her desk, revealing correspondence with anti-poaching organizations, financial records showing substantial contributions to elephant orphanages and rhino sanctuaries, and research papers I had collected about community-based conservation approaches throughout Kenya and Tanzania. The materials represented years of passionate engagement with environmental protection that had remained completely hidden from my marriage. Dr. Kiptanui examined my files with increasing amazement, recognizing several organizations and projects that intersected with her own research work. Her expression transformed from polite concern to genuine excitement as she realized that my conservation involvement represented far more than casual charitable giving. Victoria, these are substantial contributions to some of the most effective conservation programs in East Africa, she said, looking up from my financial records with obvious respect. The anti-poaching units you funded in Amboseli have prevented dozens of elephant killings over the past 18 months. The community education programs you supported in the Maasai Triangle have created economic incentives that directly benefit wildlife protection efforts. Her recognition of my conservation work and its tangible impact created an emotional response that surprised me with its intensity. For 3 years, I had been supporting wildlife protection efforts from thousands of miles away, receiving updates and reports about successful interventions but never directly witnessing the results of my investments. Now, suddenly, I was receiving confirmation from a field researcher that my hidden passion had produced meaningful real-world outcomes. I never imagined that someone would recognize specific projects or understand their broader significance, I admitted, feeling tears of relief and validation that had been building throughout years of having my interests dismissed and minimized. My husband considered my conservation work a waste of money that could be better invested in traditional financial instruments. Dr. Kiptanui's expression darkened as she began understanding the psychological dynamics that had led to my abandonment in her research station. She had encountered similar situations during her career, where women's scientific interests or environmental passions were systematically discouraged by partners who felt threatened by expertise or knowledge that exceeded their own understanding. Victoria, what your husband did to you is unconscionable, but his actions may have inadvertently provided you with exactly the opportunity you need to transform your conservation work from distant funding into direct field involvement, she said. Her voice carrying both anger about my treatment and excitement about future possibilities. We have been seeking someone with your combination of financial resources and genuine commitment to join our research initiatives as a collaborative partner. Her proposal represented everything I had dreamed about during years of reading research reports and wildlife protection updates in my Chicago apartment, while working a pharmaceutical marketing job that provided income but no emotional satisfaction. The possibility of directly participating in conservation work, rather than simply funding it from a distance, had always seemed impossible due to career obligations and Marcus's complete lack of support for environmental interests. What kind of collaborative partnership would be possible for someone with my background? I asked, hardly daring to hope that my abandonment could transform into the career opportunity I had never imagined could be available to someone without formal scientific training. Dr. Kiptanui began outlining research projects and conservation initiatives that required exactly the combination of resources, dedication, and practical experience that my 3 years of funding work had provided. Her station coordinated with anti-poaching organizations that needed equipment and operational support, community conservancy programs that required development funding, and wildlife research projects that depended upon private contributions to supplement limited government resources. Our most urgent need involves expanding community-based conservation programs that create economic incentives for wildlife protection while supporting traditional Maasai culture and land use practices, she explained, pulling out maps and photographs that illustrated successful partnership examples. These initiatives require someone who understands both conservation science and practical implementation challenges, someone who can work directly with communities while maintaining connections to international funding sources. The program she described represented exactly the type of meaningful work I had dreamed about during countless evenings spent reviewing conservation project reports while Marcus attended finance industry social events that held no interest for me. The opportunity to apply my business background and financial resources directly to wildlife protection efforts, while working alongside researchers and community leaders who shared my environmental values, felt like discovering a career that had been designed specifically for my skills and passions. Dr. Kiptanui, I would be honored to participate in any conservation work that could benefit from my background and resources, I said, feeling more genuine excitement about professional possibilities than I had experienced in years. My marketing experience includes project management, stakeholder relationship development, and strategic planning skills that might translate effectively to conservation program implementation. Her response revealed that my business skills were not only relevant to conservation work, but actually essential for successful program development and sustainability. Many excellent conservation ideas failed due to inadequate planning, insufficient stakeholder engagement, or lack of systematic approaches to measuring and communicating impact to potential funding sources. Victoria, your combination of marketing expertise, financial resources, and proven commitment to conservation work represents exactly what we need for expanding our most promising initiatives, she said with enthusiasm that made my heart race with possibility. Would you be interested in spending the next several weeks here at the station, learning about our projects firsthand and exploring how your skills could contribute to wildlife protection efforts? The invitation represented everything I had secretly hoped for during years of dreaming about meaningful career alternatives to pharmaceutical marketing. Rather than simply reading about conservation work in reports and updates, I would have the opportunity to experience field research directly, work alongside professional scientists and conservationists, and apply my business skills to environmental protection efforts that aligned with my deepest values and interests. I would be grateful for any opportunity to contribute to conservation work and learn about field research approaches, I replied, trying to maintain professional composure while internally celebrating the recognition that my skills and interests had value in environmental protection contexts. Dr. Kiptanui began organizing accommodation arrangements and introducing me to research station personnel who would help familiarize me with ongoing projects and operational procedures. The facility housed 8 permanent researchers, 3 graduate students, and various visiting scientists who collaborated on ecosystem studies, wildlife population monitoring, and community outreach programs. My living quarters were modest but comfortable, consisting of a single room with basic furniture, shared bathroom facilities, and access to the communal kitchen, where researchers prepared meals and gathered for evening discussions about their work. The simplicity of the accommodation felt liberating rather than restrictive, particularly after years of accumulating possessions that provided no genuine satisfaction or personal meaning. That evening, I joined the research station community for dinner and their traditional daily briefing, where team members shared updates about current projects, discussed challenges and successes, and coordinated upcoming activities. The intellectual energy and shared commitment to environmental protection created an atmosphere of collaborative purpose that I had never experienced in corporate settings. Dr. James Mutuku, the station's wildlife behavioral specialist, presented findings from his elephant family social structure research that directly related to anti-poaching protection strategies I had been funding through distant charitable contributions. His work demonstrated how understanding elephant communication patterns and family relationships could improve ranger effectiveness in predicting and preventing poaching attempts. Female elephants maintain complex social networks that extend across multiple family groups, he explained, showing photographs and behavioral charts that illustrated communication patterns invisible to casual observers. When anti-poaching units understand these relationships, they can predict elephant movements more accurately and position protection resources more effectively. His research represented exactly the type of scientific foundation that made conservation funding most effective, bridging theoretical understanding with practical protection applications that saved wildlife lives. I realized that my financial contributions had been supporting work whose sophistication and importance exceeded anything I had understood from reading summary reports. Dr. Kiptanui noticed my intense engagement with the research presentations and my detailed questions about methodology and applications. After dinner, she approached me privately with a proposal that would accelerate my transition from distant donor to active conservation participant. Victoria, tomorrow we are conducting a community outreach session with local Maasai leaders about expanding wildlife corridors that connect protected areas with traditional grazing lands, she said, her tone suggesting both invitation and assessment of my readiness for fieldwork. Your marketing background and communication skills could provide valuable perspectives on how to present conservation benefits in terms that resonate with community priorities and concerns. The opportunity to participate directly in conservation work, rather than simply funding it from Chicago, represented the actualization of dreams I had barely dared to acknowledge during years of corporate employment and marriage, to someone who dismissed my environmental interests as impractical fantasies. As I prepared for sleep in my simple research station accommodation surrounded by the sounds of African night wildlife that I had been supporting for 3 years without ever experiencing directly, I felt a profound sense of alignment between my circumstances and my authentic values that had been missing throughout my adult life. Marcus had intended his abandonment as punishment that would force me to recognize my dependence upon his protection and guidance. Instead, his cruelty had delivered me to exactly the environment where my hidden conservation expertise could flourish into meaningful career opportunities that would provide both personal fulfillment and tangible environmental impact. The research station represented not imprisonment but liberation, not isolation but community, not punishment but reward. For years of supporting work, I had finally found the opportunity to experience firsthand. Tomorrow would bring my first direct participation in conservation fieldwork, marking the beginning of a transformation that would exceed anything Marcus could have imagined when he arranged my abandonment in the African wilderness. The pre-dawn hours in the Masai Mara carried a crystalline quality that transformed the landscape into something approaching sacred territory, where the boundary between earth and sky seemed to dissolve in the gentle light that preceded sunrise. I stood outside the research station at 5:30 in the morning, breathing air that felt cleaner and more vital than anything I had experienced during years of urban living in Chicago. Today marked my first direct participation in conservation fieldwork, and the anticipation created an energy that had been absent from my professional life for longer than I cared to acknowledge. Dr. Kiptanui emerged from the station carrying field equipment and data collection materials that would support our community outreach session with local Maasai leaders regarding wildlife corridor expansion initiatives. Her movements demonstrated the efficiency of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar meetings, yet her expression suggested genuine excitement about including me in this critical conservation work that required both scientific knowledge and diplomatic communication skills. Victoria, Today's meeting represents 3 months of preparation and relationship building with community elders, who will ultimately determine whether wildlife corridors can be expanded to connect fragmented habitat areas, she explained while loading GPS units, soil analysis equipment, and photographic documentation into our field vehicle. Their decision will affect migration patterns for thousands of animals and influence conservation outcomes across the entire ecosystem. The significance of this community meeting extended far beyond simple policy discussions or academic research presentations. These Maasai leaders possess traditional knowledge about land management, animal behavior, and seasonal patterns that represented generations of accumulated wisdom essential for successful conservation initiatives. Their support would enable wildlife protection strategies that balanced environmental preservation with cultural traditions and economic needs of local communities. During the 40-minute drive to the meeting location, Dr. Kiptanui provided detailed background about the complex challenges facing community-based conservation programs in regions where traditional pastoral lifestyles intersected with modern wildlife protection requirements. These situations required diplomatic skills, cultural sensitivity, and creative problem-solving approaches that could identify mutually beneficial solutions for both human communities and animal populations. The key to successful conservation partnerships involves understanding that local communities are not obstacles to wildlife protection, but rather essential partners whose cooperation determines whether preservation efforts succeed or fail, she explained, navigating our vehicle across terrain that would have challenged Marcus's driving abilities significantly. When communities benefit economically from wildlife conservation, they become powerful advocates for environmental protection rather than competitors for land use resources. Her perspective aligned perfectly with research conclusions I had encountered during 3 years of studying conservation approaches and funding various protection initiatives across East Africa. The most successful wildlife preservation programs consistently demonstrated that sustainable solutions required integration of environmental goals with community economic development and cultural preservation objectives. We arrived at a traditional Maasai settlement where community leaders had gathered beneath an enormous baobab tree that served as the customary meeting location for important discussions affecting land use and resource management decisions. The setting possessed a timeless quality that connected contemporary conservation challenges with traditional governance structures that had managed these landscapes sustainably for centuries. The community elders ranged in age from approximately 40 to 70 years old, each representing different family groups and geographic areas that would be affected by potential wildlife corridor development. Their weathered faces reflected decades of experience managing livestock, navigating seasonal variations, and adapting traditional practices to changing environmental and economic conditions. Joseph Sankale, the eldest community leader, served as the primary spokesperson for this consultation session. He was approximately 65 years old, possessed dignified bearing that commanded respect from both community members and visiting researchers, and spoke English with the careful precision of someone who understood the importance of clear communication during complex negotiations. Dr. Kiptanui, we appreciate your continued respect for our traditional consultation processes and your recognition that successful conservation requires partnership rather than external imposition, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to representing community interests during challenging discussions. Today we hope to understand more clearly how wildlife corridor expansion can support both animal protection and our pastoral lifestyle requirements. Dr. Kiptanui began her presentation by acknowledging traditional Maasai knowledge about animal behavior and seasonal patterns, demonstrating respect for indigenous expertise while explaining how scientific research could complement traditional understanding to enhance conservation effectiveness. Her diplomatic approach created an atmosphere of mutual respect that encouraged open discussion rather than defensive responses to external suggestions. Our research has confirmed what Maasai communities have understood for generations, she said, displaying maps that showed wildlife movement patterns overlaid with traditional grazing routes. Animals and livestock can share landscapes successfully when movement corridors maintain connectivity between essential resource areas and seasonal grazing locations. The maps revealed intricate relationships between wildlife migration routes and traditional pastoral practices that demonstrated remarkable compatibility when properly coordinated. Elephant families followed ancient pathways that avoided primary livestock areas during critical seasons, while wildebeest and zebra migrations utilized different corridor sections that complemented rather than competed with community grazing schedules. Joseph Sankale studied these maps with obvious interest, occasionally consulting with other community leaders in rapid Ma conversations. Before returning his attention to Dr. Kiptanui's presentation, his engagement suggested genuine consideration of conservation proposals rather than polite tolerance for academic research that held no practical relevance for community priorities. These patterns match our traditional knowledge about animal movements and seasonal resource availability, he confirmed, pointing to specific areas where wildlife corridors intersected with community lands. However, our concern involves ensuring that conservation agreements provide economic benefits that justify any limitations on land use flexibility or livestock management options. His response created the perfect opportunity for me to contribute marketing expertise and communication skills to conservation discussions that could benefit from business perspectives on stakeholder engagement and value proposition development. Dr. Kiptanui had indicated that my background in pharmaceutical marketing could provide valuable insights into presenting complex benefits in terms that resonated with community priorities and concerns. Mr. Sankale, your question about economic benefits highlights exactly the type of strategic considerations that ensure conservation programs succeed by aligning environmental goals with community prosperity, I said, speaking for the first time during the meeting while drawing upon years of experience in stakeholder communication and value articulation. The most sustainable wildlife protection initiatives create economic opportunities that exceed any potential limitations on traditional land use practices. My contribution to the discussion generated immediate attention from both the community leaders and Dr. Kiptanui, who recognized that my business communication skills could effectively bridge the gap between scientific research findings and practical community concerns about economic impacts and opportunity costs associated with conservation participation. Joseph Sankale studied me with obvious curiosity, apparently surprised that someone other than Dr. Kiptanui possessed knowledge about conservation economics and community partnership development. His expression suggested respect for my willingness to engage with complex issues, rather than remaining silent during technical discussions that affected local livelihoods and cultural practices. Your perspective suggests understanding of community priorities beyond simple environmental protection, he said, his tone indicating both assessment and appreciation for practical approaches to conservation challenges. What specific economic benefits would justify community participation in wildlife corridor expansion programs? Quote. His question provided the opportunity to apply 3 years of conservation research and business analysis skills to real-world problem-solving that could produce tangible outcomes for both wildlife protection and community economic development. I had studied successful community-based conservation models across multiple countries and understood the financial mechanisms that created sustainable incentive structures for environmental preservation. Successful conservation partnerships typically generate revenue through multiple channels that diversify community income sources while protecting traditional practices, I explained, drawing upon case studies and economic analyses I had reviewed during years of funding various protection initiatives. These include wildlife tourism revenue sharing, conservation employment opportunities, sustainable resource management agreements, and carbon credit programs that provide payments for environmental services. My detailed knowledge of conservation economics and program implementation strategies surprised both Dr. Kiptanui and the community leaders, who had expected general business insights rather than specific expertise about wildlife protection financing mechanisms and community partnership structures. Their attention encouraged me to continue explaining economic models that had proven successful in similar community conservation initiatives. Wildlife tourism revenue represents the most immediately visible benefit, but comprehensive conservation partnerships also create employment opportunities for community members as guides, rangers, wildlife monitors, and education program coordinators. I continued, feeling increasing confidence as my hidden expertise found practical application in real conservation planning discussions. Additionally, conservation agreements can include guaranteed market access for traditional crafts, organic agriculture products, and cultural tourism experiences that celebrate Maasai heritage while generating sustainable income. Joseph Sankale exchanged glances with other community leaders, engaging in brief Ma conversations before returning his attention to our discussion with obvious increased interest in conservation partnership possibilities that could provide substantial economic benefits rather than simply requesting community cooperation for external research objectives. Your understanding of conservation economics suggests experience beyond general business knowledge, he observed, his tone carrying both curiosity and respect for expertise that could contribute meaningfully to community decision-making processes. Have you worked previously with community conservation programs in East Africa or other regions? His question created a moment of truth where I needed to decide how much to reveal about my extensive conservation funding work and the professional relationships I had developed with wildlife protection organizations across multiple countries. Dr. Kiptanui observed this exchange with growing amazement as she began understanding the true extent of my conservation background and practical experience with program development and implementation strategies. I have been funding conservation initiatives across East Africa for 3 years, including anti-poaching operations, community education programs, and wildlife monitoring projects, I admitted, recognizing that honesty about my background would enhance credibility and enable more meaningful contributions to conservation planning discussions. These experiences have provided insight into successful program models and implementation challenges that affect community partnerships and environmental outcomes. The revelation of my substantial conservation funding experience transformed the entire dynamic of our meeting, as both Dr. Kiptanui and the community leaders began understanding that my participation represented far more than casual visitor involvement in wildlife protection discussions. My practical knowledge of conservation program operations and funding mechanisms positioned me as a potential partner rather than simply an interested observer. Joseph Senkole's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine engagement, as he recognized that my conservation background could contribute meaningful resources and expertise to community development initiatives that balanced environmental protection with economic advancement and cultural preservation objectives. Your funding experience with conservation programs provides valuable perspective on partnership development and sustainable implementation strategies, he said, his tone suggesting recognition of potential collaboration opportunities that could benefit both wildlife protection and community prosperity. Would you be interested in discussing specific conservation initiatives that could support community development goals while advancing environmental protection objectives? Quote, his invitation represented exactly the type of meaningful engagement I had dreamed about during years of supporting conservation work from thousands of miles away, while maintaining a corporate marketing career that provided financial resources but no emotional satisfaction. The opportunity to apply my business skills and conservation knowledge directly to community partnership development exceeded anything I had imagined possible when Marcus abandoned me at the research station. Dr. Kiptanui observed this exchange with obvious excitement, recognizing that my combination of conservation funding experience, business communication skills, and genuine commitment to wildlife protection could accelerate community partnership development that had been progressing slowly through traditional academic research and diplomatic relationship building approaches. Victoria, your expertise in conservation program development and community engagement could provide exactly the type of strategic partnership support we need for expanding successful conservation initiatives throughout this region, she said, her voice carrying both professional recognition and personal appreciation for unexpected expertise that could enhance research station effectiveness and conservation outcomes. The community meeting continued for 3 more hours, with detailed discussions about specific conservation initiatives that could provide immediate economic benefits while establishing foundations for long-term wildlife protection and community development programs. My contributions focused on program design, stakeholder engagement strategies, and financial mechanisms that had proven successful in similar community conservation partnerships across East Africa and other regions. By the time we concluded the meeting, preliminary agreements had been established for pilot conservation programs that would demonstrate the economic and environmental benefits of expanded wildlife corridor development. Community leaders had committed to organizing broader discussions involving all affected families and geographic areas, while Dr. Kiptanui had agreed to develop detailed implementation proposals that addressed community priorities and concerns. As we drove back to the research station in the late afternoon heat, I felt a profound sense of professional fulfillment that had been absent throughout my corporate marketing career and marriage to someone who consistently dismissed my conservation interests and environmental knowledge. Today had provided the first opportunity to apply my hidden expertise directly to meaningful conservation work that could produce tangible outcomes for both wildlife protection and community development. Victoria, your contribution to today's meeting exceeded anything I expected from someone without formal conservation training or previous field experience, Dr. Kiptanui said, her tone carrying both surprise and respect for expertise that had proven immediately valuable in challenging conservation partnership negotiations. Your combination of business skills, conservation knowledge, and genuine cultural sensitivity created exactly the type of stakeholder engagement that successful community partnerships require. Her recognition of my conservation capabilities and potential contributions to wildlife protection initiatives represented validation that had been missing throughout years of supporting environmental causes from a distance, while maintaining professional and personal relationships that systematically minimized my knowledge and interests. As we approached the research station where I would spend another evening learning about conservation work from researchers who shared my environmental values and recognized my expertise, I began understanding that Marcus's cruel abandonment had inadvertently provided access to the career opportunities and professional community I had been seeking throughout my adult life, without recognizing their availability or my qualifications for meaningful participation. The satellite phone in Dr. Kiptanui's office rang at precisely 7:15 in the morning, interrupting our review of community partnership proposals with an urgency that immediately commanded attention throughout the research station. Emergency calls during early morning hours typically indicated poaching incidents, wildlife medical emergencies, or critical situations requiring immediate scientific intervention and coordination with Kenya Wildlife Service authorities. Dr. Kiptanui answered the call with professional efficiency, while gesturing for me to remain present during the conversation, apparently recognizing that my conservation background might provide valuable perspectives on whatever crisis had prompted this urgent communication from external organizations. Her expression grew increasingly serious as she listened to details that would soon transform my involvement from visitor participation to essential partnership in addressing complex conservation challenges. "We understand the severity of the situation and will coordinate our response immediately," she said into the phone while taking detailed notes about locations, resources, and personnel requirements that would determine our station's capacity to support emergency conservation operations. "Please confirm aircraft availability and provide updates every 30 minutes until we establish field communication capabilities." The call originated from the East African Wildlife Protection Alliance, a consortium of conservation organizations that coordinated responses to large-scale poaching operations, habitat destruction incidents, and wildlife medical emergencies requiring specialized expertise and rapid resource deployment across multiple national boundaries and jurisdictional authorities. Dr. Kiptanui ended the call and immediately began organizing emergency response procedures that would mobilize research station personnel and equipment for addressing what she described as the most serious poaching crisis detected in the Masai Mara ecosystem during the past 18 months. Her actions demonstrated the systematic coordination and leadership capabilities essential for managing complex conservation emergencies under time-sensitive conditions. "Victoria, we have received confirmation of a coordinated poaching operation targeting elephant families near the Tanzanian border," she explained while gathering emergency communication equipment, medical supplies, and documentation materials required for field operations in remote locations. "This situation requires immediate response coordination with multiple organizations and government agencies to prevent significant wildlife casualties and capture individuals responsible for these illegal activities." The elephant poaching emergency represented exactly the type of crisis that my conservation funding had been designed to prevent through support of anti-poaching operations, ranger training programs, and community education initiatives that created economic incentives for wildlife protection rather than illegal exploitation. However, experiencing such an emergency firsthand revealed the complexity and coordination challenges that determine success or failure of conservation interventions. Dr. Kiptanui continued briefing me about emergency response protocols while assembling field equipment that would support wildlife protection operations requiring scientific documentation, veterinary intervention, and coordination with law enforcement agencies pursuing criminal prosecution of poaching organizations. Her preparation demonstrated professional competence developed through years of managing similar crises under challenging conditions. Our research station serves as the Regional Coordination Center for Conservation Emergencies because we maintain communication equipment, medical facilities, and personnel trained in wildlife emergency response procedures, she explained while checking GPS units, radio frequencies, and emergency medical supplies. "Today's operation will require coordination with Kenya Wildlife Service rangers, Tanzanian conservation authorities, veterinary specialists, and community anti-poaching units that you have been funding through your charitable contributions." Her mention of my conservation funding work in the context of emergency response operations created a profound sense of connection between my distant financial support and real-world wildlife protection activities that required immediate action to prevent animal deaths and environmental destruction. This represented the first opportunity to witness directly how my contributions translated into tangible conservation outcomes under crisis conditions. "Dr. Kiptanui, my conservation funding experience includes support for several anti-poaching organizations that operate in cross-border regions," I said, recognizing potential opportunities to contribute practical knowledge about resource coordination and operational procedures to emergency response planning. "Would it be helpful for me to contact organizations I have worked with to coordinate additional resources or specialized expertise for addressing this poaching emergency?" Her response revealed that my conservation network relationships could provide access to resources and capabilities that would significantly enhance emergency response effectiveness, while demonstrating professional recognition of my expertise in conservation program coordination and stakeholder engagement strategies. Victoria, your connections with anti-poaching organizations could provide exactly the type of additional support we need for addressing this large-scale operation, she said, with obvious appreciation for resources that could supplement research station capabilities. Emergency response effectiveness often depends upon rapid coordination of specialized expertise and equipment that individual organizations cannot provide independently. I immediately began contacting conservation organizations through secure communication channels that I had established during 3 years of funding wildlife protection initiatives across East Africa. These relationships included anti-poaching unit commanders, veterinary specialists, aircraft operators, and logistics coordinators whose expertise would prove essential for successful emergency response operations. My first call reached Commander David Kiprotich of the Northern Frontier Anti-Poaching Unit, an organization that had received substantial funding support from my conservation contributions and maintained detailed knowledge about poaching organizations operating across Kenya-Tanzania border regions. His immediate recognition of my voice and situation created efficient coordination that would have been impossible through standard institutional channels. Victoria, we have been monitoring communications about this poaching operation and have personnel positioned to respond within 2 hours of receiving deployment authorization, he reported with military precision that reflected his background in Kenya Defense Forces before transitioning to conservation work. Our intelligence indicates this represents a sophisticated operation involving multiple teams and advanced equipment that requires coordinated response from several agencies. Commander Kiprotich's detailed knowledge about the poaching operation demonstrated the effectiveness of information networks that connected anti-poaching organizations across multiple countries and jurisdictions. His unit had been tracking suspicious activities for several weeks, while gathering evidence that would support criminal prosecutions and dismantling of organized poaching networks. My second communication reached Dr. Margaret Wanjiku, a veterinary specialist whose elephant medical expertise had been supported through my conservation funding and whose emergency response capabilities would prove essential for treating any animals injured during poaching attempts or rescue operations. Her availability for immediate deployment represented exactly the type of specialized resource coordination that emergency situations required. Dr. Wanjiku, we need your elephant medical expertise for an emergency response operation in the Masai Mara region, I explained, while providing location details and coordination information that would enable her rapid deployment to support wildlife rescue activities. Dr. Kiptanui's research station is serving as the operational coordination center, and we expect multiple agencies will be participating in this response effort. Her immediate commitment to participating in emergency operations demonstrated the professional dedication and collaborative spirit that characterized the conservation community I had been supporting financially, but never experienced directly until my abandonment at the research station created opportunities for hands-on involvement in wildlife protection activities. Within 90 minutes, I had coordinated emergency response contributions from 6 different organizations that represented anti-poaching specialists, veterinary medical expertise, aircraft support, communications coordination, legal documentation services, and community liaison capabilities essential for addressing complex conservation emergencies that required multi-jurisdictional cooperation. Dr. Kiptanui observed my rapid coordination of external resources with growing amazement, recognizing that my conservation network relationships provided access to specialized capabilities that would significantly enhance emergency response effectiveness while demonstrating professional competence in crisis management and stakeholder coordination strategies. Victoria, your ability to mobilize these specialized resources within 2 hours exceeds anything we could have accomplished through traditional institutional coordination procedures, she said with obvious respect for professional capabilities that had transformed our emergency response capacity. Your conservation network relationships represent exactly the type of strategic partnerships that enable successful wildlife protection operations under time-sensitive conditions. The helicopter arrival at our research station marked the beginning of coordinated field operations that would demonstrate the effectiveness of conservation partnerships when properly organized and strategically implemented. Aircraft support had been provided through my connections with conservation organizations that maintained emergency response capabilities for addressing large-scale wildlife protection crises. Commander Kiprotich arrived with a team of 12 specialized anti-poaching rangers, whose training and equipment represented years of development supported through conservation funding that I had provided without ever witnessing their operational capabilities firsthand. Their professional competence and dedication to wildlife protection created emotional impact that exceeded anything I had experienced during corporate marketing work or personal relationships that dismissed my environmental interests. Dr. Wanjiku brought veterinary equipment and expertise that would enable medical treatment for any elephants injured during poaching attempts or rescue operations. Her immediate coordination with research station personnel demonstrated the collaborative effectiveness that characterized successful conservation partnerships, when professional expertise aligned with adequate resources and strategic planning. The field operation required coordination between multiple aircraft, ground personnel, communication systems, and logistics support that demonstrated the complexity of successful wildlife protection efforts. My role involved maintaining communication coordination between various organizations and agencies while documenting activities that would support legal prosecution of poaching organizations and evaluation of emergency response effectiveness. During the 6-hour operation, we successfully intercepted poaching teams before they could harm targeted elephant families, while gathering evidence that would enable criminal prosecution and dismantling of organized wildlife trafficking networks. The coordination between anti-poaching units, veterinary specialists, aircraft support, and research documentation created exactly the type of comprehensive response that my conservation funding had been designed to enable. The success of emergency operations provided profound validation of conservation partnership strategies and demonstrated tangible outcomes from years of financial support for wildlife protection initiatives. Witnessing the professional dedication and effectiveness of personnel whose training and equipment I had helped fund created emotional fulfillment that exceeded anything available through corporate success or personal relationships that failed to recognize my authentic values and interests. Commander Kiprotich approached me during post-operation debriefing to express appreciation for coordination support that had enhanced response effectiveness, while acknowledging the financial contributions that had made specialized training and equipment possible for successful wildlife protection outcomes. Victoria, your coordination of emergency resources and previous funding support for anti-poaching operations have contributed directly to saving multiple elephant families and capturing individuals responsible for organized wildlife trafficking, he said, with professional recognition that validated years of conservation commitment. This type of comprehensive support represents exactly what conservation efforts require for achieving sustainable wildlife protection outcomes. Dr. Wanjiku echoed similar appreciation for conservation support that had enabled veterinary capabilities essential for wildlife medical emergencies and rescue operations. Her recognition of my contributions to conservation effectiveness provided professional validation that had been absent throughout corporate marketing career and personal relationships that systematically minimized environmental interests. Your funding support for veterinary training and emergency medical equipment has enabled successful treatment of wildlife injuries and development of medical protocols that prevent casualties during conservation operations, she explained while organizing medical supplies and documentation from the day's activities. This represents exactly the type of strategic investment that produces measurable conservation outcomes and builds sustainable wildlife protection capabilities. The professional recognition from conservation specialists whose expertise I respected created profound emotional impact and confirmation that my hidden environmental interests possessed genuine value and practical application in meaningful wildlife protection work that aligned with authentic personal values and professional aspirations. Dr. Kiptanui documented the day's emergency response success while acknowledging my contribution to coordination effectiveness and resource mobilization that had enhanced operational outcomes beyond anything possible through individual organizational capabilities. Her evaluation would become part of conservation partnership assessments that influenced future emergency response planning and stakeholder engagement strategies. Victoria, today's emergency response demonstrated your exceptional capabilities in conservation coordination and resource mobilization under crisis conditions, she said, while completing operational reports that would be shared with conservation organizations throughout East Africa. Your combination of strategic thinking, professional network relationships, and genuine commitment to wildlife protection represents exactly the type of leadership that successful conservation efforts require. Her professional assessment created recognition that my conservation background and business skills could contribute meaningfully to wildlife protection initiatives beyond occasional volunteer participation or financial support. The emergency response had demonstrated practical capabilities that positioned me as a potential partner in ongoing conservation program development and implementation strategies. As evening approached and emergency response teams departed from the research station, I reflected upon the day's events while processing emotional impact that exceeded anything from previous professional or personal experiences. The successful protection of elephant families through coordinated conservation efforts represented tangible achievement that aligned perfectly with authentic values and interests that had remained hidden throughout years of corporate employment and marriage to someone who dismissed environmental concerns. The emergency response operation had provided opportunities to apply business coordination skills, conservation knowledge, and professional network relationships to meaningful wildlife protection work that produced immediate outcomes and demonstrated sustainable impact strategies. This represented exactly the type of purposeful career engagement that had been missing throughout adult life while pursuing financial success and social expectations that failed to recognize authentic interests and capabilities. Dr. Kiptanui invited me to participate in post-operation evaluation sessions that would assess emergency response effectiveness while developing recommendations for improving future conservation coordination and resource mobilization capabilities. My inclusion in professional assessment activities represented recognition that my contributions possessed ongoing value beyond temporary visitor participation in research station activities. The successful emergency response had transformed my status from abandoned tourist to recognized conservation partner whose expertise and resources could contribute meaningfully to wildlife protection initiatives that required strategic coordination, professional networking, and systematic resource mobilization under challenging conditions that tested both individual capabilities and organizational effectiveness. The East African Conservation Alliance headquarters in Nairobi represented the pinnacle of regional wildlife protection coordination, where decisions affecting millions of animals and thousands of square kilometers of protected ecosystems were made through collaborative partnerships between government agencies, international organizations, and local communities. 3 weeks after the successful elephant poaching emergency response, I received an invitation to participate in strategic planning sessions that would determine conservation priorities and resource allocation across multiple countries and protected areas. Dr. Catherine Mwangi, the Alliance's executive director, had reviewed detailed reports about my coordination capabilities during the poaching crisis and my extensive background in funding conservation initiatives throughout East Africa. Her invitation represented recognition that my combination of business expertise, conservation knowledge, and professional network relationships could contribute meaningfully to strategic decision-making processes that influenced wildlife protection outcomes across the entire region. The Alliance headquarters occupied a modern building in Nairobi's diplomatic quarter, where international development organizations, environmental foundations, and government agencies maintained offices that facilitated coordination of conservation programs requiring multinational cooperation and resource sharing. The facility housed comprehensive data systems, communication networks, and meeting spaces designed to support complex planning processes involving dozens of stakeholder organizations. Dr. Mwangi possessed impressive credentials that included advanced degrees in wildlife ecology and environmental policy, 15 years of field research experience, and demonstrated success in developing conservation partnerships that balanced environmental protection with community economic development objectives. Her leadership of the Alliance represented recognition from the international conservation community that her strategic vision and operational competence could advance wildlife protection efforts through collaborative approaches. Ms. Ashford, your coordination of emergency response resources during the recent poaching crisis demonstrated exactly the type of strategic thinking and professional network capabilities that our alliance requires for addressing increasingly complex conservation challenges, she said during our initial meeting in her office overlooking Nairobi National Park. We would like to explore opportunities for formalizing your involvement in regional conservation planning and program implementation activities. Her proposal exceeded anything I had imagined possible when Marcus abandoned me at the research station 4 weeks earlier with the intention of teaching me lessons about dependence and gratitude. Instead of punishing me for displaying knowledge and independence that threatened his ego, his cruel actions had delivered me directly into professional opportunities that aligned perfectly with authentic interests and capabilities that had been suppressed throughout years of corporate employment and marriage to someone who systematically dismissed environmental concerns. The strategic planning session brought together conservation leaders from 12 countries, representing government agencies, research institutions, community organizations, and international foundations whose coordinated efforts determined the effectiveness of wildlife protection initiatives across East Africa. The participants possessed decades of combined experience in addressing poaching, habitat destruction, human-wildlife conflict, and climate change impacts that threatened ecosystem stability and species survival. Dr. James Mukasa from Uganda Wildlife Authority presented data about elephant population recovery in protected areas where community-based conservation programs had created economic incentives for wildlife protection rather than exploitation. His findings demonstrated measurable improvements in animal survival rates and habitat quality when local communities received direct benefits from conservation tourism and sustainable resource management agreements. The presentation validated strategic approaches that my conservation funding had been supporting for 3 years, confirming that community partnership models produce superior outcomes compared to traditional preservation approaches that excluded local populations from economic benefits associated with wildlife protection. The data provided empirical evidence that justified continued investment in collaborative conservation strategies. Professor Sarah Luwanga from Makerere University Research Institute contributed findings about habitat connectivity requirements for maintaining viable wildlife populations during periods of environmental change and human development pressure. Her research emphasized the critical importance of wildlife corridors that enabled animal movement between protected areas while supporting traditional land use practices that complemented rather than competed with conservation objectives. Her presentation directly related to community partnership discussions I had participated in with Maasai leaders regarding wildlife corridor expansion initiatives. The scientific foundations for corridor development that she described provided technical justification for community conservation agreements that balanced environmental protection with cultural preservation and economic development priorities. Dr. Michael Nzomo from Kenya Wildlife Service presented analysis of anti-poaching effectiveness that demonstrated measurable improvements in wildlife protection when community reporting networks, rapid response capabilities, and legal prosecution efforts operated as coordinated systems rather than independent activities. His findings highlighted the importance of comprehensive approaches that addressed multiple aspects of wildlife trafficking and illegal exploitation. The anti-poaching data confirmed the effectiveness of integrated strategies that my conservation funding had been supporting through multiple organizations whose specialized capabilities contributed to overall protection outcomes. The research validated coordinated resource allocation approaches that maximized conservation impact through strategic partnerships rather than competing individual efforts. During lunch discussions with conservation professionals whose expertise I had been supporting financially without ever meeting personally, I gained deeper understanding of implementation challenges and operational complexities that determined program success or failure under field conditions. These conversations revealed opportunities for applying business management skills and strategic planning experience to conservation program development and effectiveness enhancement. Commander Patricia Kimani from the Anti-Poaching Coordination Unit approached me during the afternoon break to discuss resource mobilization strategies that could improve response capabilities for addressing large-scale wildlife trafficking operations. Her background included military training, law enforcement experience, and specialized knowledge about organized criminal networks that targeted high-value wildlife products for international markets. Victoria, your coordination of emergency response resources demonstrated understanding of operational requirements and resource allocation strategies that could significantly enhance our anti-poaching effectiveness, she said while reviewing equipment needs and training requirements that exceeded current funding capabilities. We would welcome opportunities to discuss comprehensive support partnerships that could address multiple operational priorities simultaneously. Her recognition of my operational coordination capabilities and potential contribution to anti-poaching program enhancement represented professional validation that exceeded anything available through corporate marketing achievements or personal relationships that failed to acknowledge authentic interests and expertise in environmental protection activities. Dr. Robert Chariot from the Community Conservation Research Center presented findings about economic impact assessments that measured community benefits from wildlife tourism and conservation program participation. His research demonstrated substantial income improvements and social development outcomes when conservation partnerships provided genuine economic opportunities rather than symbolic participation in environmental protection activities. The economic data validated community engagement strategies that my conservation funding had been supporting through organizations that prioritized local empowerment and benefit sharing as essential components of sustainable wildlife protection initiatives. The research confirmed that authentic partnership approaches produce superior outcomes compared to traditional conservation models that excluded community priorities from program design and implementation. During afternoon strategic planning sessions, participants developed comprehensive recommendations for regional conservation priorities that would guide resource allocation and program development over the following 3 years. The planning process required integration of scientific research findings, community partnership requirements, government policy objectives, and funding availability assessments that determined feasibility of proposed conservation initiatives. Dr. Mwangi invited me to contribute business analysis perspectives to strategic planning discussions that could benefit from market assessment techniques, stakeholder engagement strategies, and project management approaches developed through corporate experience and conservation funding activities. My participation represented recognition that business skills possess direct relevance to conservation program planning and implementation effectiveness. The strategic planning discussions revealed opportunities for applying pharmaceutical marketing experience to conservation communication challenges that required presentation of complex scientific information in formats accessible to community leaders, government officials, and funding organizations whose support determined program viability and sustainability. My contributions focused on stakeholder communication strategies, performance measurement systems, and partnership development approaches that could enhance conservation program effectiveness while building sustainable support networks among diverse constituencies whose cooperation determined long-term success or failure of wildlife protection initiatives. Dr. Mwangi approached me during the final session to discuss formalization of my involvement in alliance activities through advisory positions that would enable ongoing contributions to strategic planning, resource coordination, and program evaluation activities that required business expertise and conservation knowledge. Victoria, your combination of strategic thinking, operational coordination capabilities, and extensive conservation network relationships represents exactly the type of multidisciplinary expertise that our alliance requires for addressing 21st-century conservation challenges, she said while outlining advisory roles that would provide official recognition of my conservation expertise and platform for contributing to regional wildlife protection initiatives. Her proposal included participation in quarterly strategic planning sessions, coordination of specialized resource mobilization for emergency response situations, development of community partnership enhancement strategies, and evaluation of conservation program effectiveness using business analysis techniques that could improve impact measurement and stakeholder communication. The advisory position represented transformation from hidden conservation supporter to recognized expert whose contributions possessed official value within the regional conservation community. The opportunity exceeded anything I had imagined possible during years of supporting wildlife protection efforts from Chicago, while maintaining corporate employment and marriage to someone who consistently dismissed environmental interests as impractical fantasies. Professor Elizabeth Wanjala from the Institute for Conservation Policy Studies requested my participation in research projects that would analyze economic factors affecting conservation program sustainability and community participation effectiveness. Her research required business analysis expertise and practical knowledge about funding mechanisms that influenced program design and implementation strategies. The research collaboration represented opportunities to apply analytical skills and conservation knowledge to academic projects that could influence policy development and program enhancement throughout East Africa. The invitation validated my expertise while providing platforms for contributing to conservation knowledge advancement through systematic analysis of successful partnership models. Dr. Mwangi concluded the strategic planning session by announcing my appointment to the Alliance Advisory Council, a position that provided official recognition of conservation expertise and enabled ongoing contributions to regional wildlife protection initiatives through strategic planning, resource coordination, and program evaluation activities. The appointment represented culmination of professional transformation that began when Marcus abandoned me at the research station with intentions of teaching lessons about dependence and gratitude. Instead of diminishing my confidence or forcing recognition of limitations, his cruel actions had catalyzed emergence of authentic professional identity and conservation leadership capabilities that had been suppressed throughout years of corporate employment and marriage to someone who systematically minimized environmental interests. The Alliance Advisory Council position provided official platform for contributing business expertise, conservation knowledge, and professional network relationships to wildlife protection initiatives that aligned perfectly with authentic values and interests that had guided my hidden charitable activities for 3 years while maintaining superficial compliance with social expectations and relationship obligations. During the return flight to the Masai Mara Research Station, I reflected upon professional recognition that validated years of conservation commitment while providing opportunities for meaningful contributions to environmental protection efforts that exceeded anything possible through distant financial support or corporate marketing achievements. The Advisory Council appointment represented transformation from abandoned wife to recognized conservation leader whose expertise possessed official value within regional wildlife protection communities. The position provided authority and credibility that would enable significant contributions to conservation program development and strategic planning activities that influenced environmental outcomes across multiple countries and protected ecosystems. Dr. Kiptanui welcomed my return to the research station with obvious pride and professional achievements that had exceeded all expectations for temporary visitor participation in conservation activities. My appointment to the Alliance Advisory Council represented recognition that reflected positively upon research station effectiveness in developing conservation partnerships and identifying potential contributors to regional wildlife protection initiatives. Victoria, your appointment to the Alliance Advisory Council represents exactly the type of professional recognition that validates our research station's approach to conservation partnership development and stakeholder engagement, she said, while reviewing official documentation that confirmed my advisory position and outlined responsibilities for contributing to strategic planning and program coordination activities. The research station had provided the environment where hidden conservation expertise could flourish into recognized professional capabilities that contributed meaningfully to wildlife protection initiatives, requiring strategic coordination, resource mobilization, and stakeholder engagement expertise developed through business experience and conservation funding activities. The Advisory Council position established credibility and authority that would enable ongoing contributions to conservation efforts, while providing professional identity that aligned with authentic interests and values, rather than social expectations or relationship obligations that had constrained personal growth and career development throughout adult life. As I prepared for sleep in research station accommodation that had become home during the most transformative month of my professional life, I anticipated opportunities for contributing to conservation initiatives that would provide genuine fulfillment and measurable environmental impact through application of business skills and conservation knowledge to meaningful wildlife protection challenges that required collaborative solutions and strategic thinking. The secure communication facility at the East African Conservation Alliance headquarters provided the technological infrastructure necessary for coordinating complex international conservation initiatives that required real-time collaboration between organizations across multiple time zones and jurisdictional boundaries. 6 weeks after my appointment to the Advisory Council, I found myself utilizing these sophisticated systems to implement the most ambitious conservation project of my career, one that would reveal the true extent of my financial resources and organizational capabilities to the broader wildlife protection community. The project originated from strategic planning discussions that identified critical funding gaps preventing implementation of comprehensive anti-poaching programs across 3 countries where organized wildlife trafficking operations had intensified beyond the capacity of existing protection resources. Traditional conservation organizations possessed technical expertise and operational experience, but lacked sufficient capital for equipment procurement, personnel training, and infrastructure development necessary for effective large-scale interventions. Dr. Catherine Mwangi had approached me during the previous week with a confidential briefing about intelligence reports indicating coordinated elephant and rhino poaching operations that threatened to eliminate entire populations within protected areas unless immediate action could mobilize resources exceeding anything available through conventional funding channels or government appropriations. The briefing revealed that criminal organizations had invested substantial resources in sophisticated equipment, communication systems, and personnel recruitment that enabled systematic wildlife exploitation across vast geographic areas. These operations generated millions of dollars in illegal revenue while devastating ecosystems and threatening species survival through industrial-scale killing that exceeded the reproductive capacity of targeted animal populations. Dr. Mwangi's assessment concluded that effective countermeasures required coordinated response capabilities including advanced surveillance technology, specialized aircraft support, rapid deployment teams, and legal prosecution resources that demanded investment levels typically associated with major corporate or government initiatives rather than traditional conservation program budgets. The resource requirements she outlined aligned precisely with capabilities I had been developing through 3 years of conservation funding activities that had evolved far beyond charitable donations into comprehensive organizational infrastructure designed to support large-scale wildlife protection initiatives. However, the scope of intervention needed for addressing current poaching threats would require revealing the true magnitude of my conservation investments and organizational development to professional colleagues who understood my background only through recent research station participation and advisory council contributions. During our confidential discussion in her private office, Dr. Mwangi outlined specific resource needs that included procurement of specialized aircraft equipped with advanced surveillance systems, establishment of rapid response coordination centers, training programs for multinational anti-poaching personnel, and legal support infrastructure for prosecuting wildlife trafficking cases across international boundaries. Her presentation concluded with a direct question about my capacity for contributing to resource mobilization efforts that would determine whether comprehensive anti-poaching interventions could be implemented within the narrow time window available before poaching operations achieved irreversible population impacts on targeted species. The moment had arrived for revealing the conservation foundation that I had been developing systematically during 3 years of what Marcus had dismissed as wasteful charitable spending on impractical environmental causes. The foundation represented investment of substantial personal resources in organizational infrastructure, designed specifically for addressing large-scale conservation challenges that required sophisticated coordination and sustained financial commitment. Dr. Mwangi, my conservation involvement extends significantly beyond the funding activities and coordination capabilities you have observed during recent months, I said, recognizing that complete transparency about my foundation would transform professional relationships while enabling implementation of conservation initiatives that aligned perfectly with organizational mission and capabilities. I retrieved comprehensive documentation from my secure files that revealed the Ashford Conservation Foundation as a fully operational organization with assets exceeding $12 million dedicated specifically to wildlife protection initiatives requiring rapid response capabilities and sustained resource deployment. The foundation maintained professional staff, specialized equipment, aircraft support, and coordination infrastructure that had been developed systematically for addressing exactly the type of conservation emergencies that current intelligence reports had identified. Dr. Mwangi examined the foundation documentation with expressions that progressed from surprise to amazement, as she recognized the scope and sophistication of organizational capabilities that exceeded anything she had anticipated from our previous professional interactions. The foundation represented comprehensive infrastructure for conservation program implementation that surpassed resources available to many established international organizations. The Ashford Conservation Foundation had been incorporated in Delaware, with operational headquarters in Kenya, specialized equipment storage facilities in 3 countries, and coordination agreements with governmental agencies and conservation organizations throughout East Africa. The foundation maintained aircraft support capabilities, communication systems, emergency response teams, and legal resources specifically designed for addressing wildlife trafficking and large-scale poaching operations. The organizational structure included professional staff with backgrounds in military operations, law enforcement, wildlife biology, and international development who possessed specialized expertise for conducting complex anti-poaching interventions under challenging field conditions. The personnel represented carefully recruited capabilities that complemented foundation resources while ensuring operational effectiveness and professional competence in high-stakes conservation activities. Foundation aircraft included 2 helicopters equipped with advanced surveillance technology, medical facilities, and coordination equipment that enabled rapid response deployment and sustained operations in remote locations where traditional conservation organizations possessed limited access or intervention capabilities. The aircraft represented strategic investments in infrastructure essential for effective wildlife protection in vast ecosystems, where ground-based responses proved inadequate for addressing sophisticated poaching operations. Dr. Mwangi's review of foundation capabilities revealed recognition that my organizational resources could provide exactly the type of comprehensive support necessary for implementing anti-poaching initiatives that required coordination between multiple agencies, sustained operational deployment, and specialized equipment that exceeded availability through traditional conservation funding mechanisms. Victoria, the Ashford Conservation Foundation represents exactly the type of comprehensive resource infrastructure that our alliance has been seeking for addressing large-scale conservation emergencies, she said, her voice reflecting both professional appreciation and personal amazement at discovering organizational capabilities that had remained hidden throughout months of collaborative planning activities. Your foundation could enable implementation of anti-poaching programs that we have been unable to pursue due to resource limitations and coordination challenges. Her response validated strategic decisions I had made during 3 years of foundation development that prioritized operational capabilities and response infrastructure over traditional grant-making approaches that provided financial support without ensuring effective program implementation or measurable conservation outcomes. The foundation represented evolution from passive charitable giving to active conservation program development that leveraged business expertise, financial resources, and strategic planning capabilities for creating sustainable wildlife protection initiatives that produced measurable environmental impact through systematic intervention and resource deployment. Dr. Mwangi immediately began coordinating integration of Foundation resources with Alliance strategic planning that would enable implementation of comprehensive anti-poaching operations within the critical time window necessary for preventing irreversible wildlife population impacts. Her coordination activities demonstrated professional recognition that Foundation capabilities represented game-changing resources for regional conservation effectiveness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.